As the great dynasties of the Roman Empire waned, figures often emerged whose ascent was dictated not only by fate but also by skillful political maneuvering. Marcus Aurelius Severus Alexander Augustus, whose name was destined to be the last in a glorious line of rulers, ascended the Roman throne, bringing to a close an era in which the empire had been under the rule of the Severan Dynasty for 4 decades. His rise to power was no accident, rather, it was a strategic maneuver, played out against the backdrop of Elagabalus's rapidly weakening and discredited regime. While his predecessor lost all trust and support due to his eccentric and at times shocking actions, influential female figures within the ruling family saw in the young Severus Alexander an ideal figure to govern the state. They understood that controlling him, shaping his policies, and directing his actions would be significantly easier than reigning in his unpredictable and far more willful older cousin. This heralded a new era, where skilled manipulators, whose ambitions were just beginning to unfold, operated behind the scenes of power. The childhood and youth of the future Caesar, Severus Alexander, were spent at the very heart of the imperial court, made possible by the strong and strategically vital ties between his grandmother, the unyielding Julia Maesa, and her sister, the powerful Empress Julia Domna. However, the idol of the imperial household was short-lived. In 217 AD, when the startling news of Emperor Caracalla's death, Julia Domna's son, swept through Rome, the powerful sisters, who once shaped the empire's destiny, found themselves in exile. The short-lived Emperor Macrinus, who swiftly seized power, sent them to their native Syrian city of Emesa, believing that he had thereby definitively eliminated a potential threat, but his calculations proved wrong. Far from the capital, in the heart of the east, Julia Maesa and Julia Domna began methodically consolidating their influence, building a network of support. They secured the loyalty of local legions, promising them immense wealth and unprecedented rewards capable of changing their fortunes. And, most audaciously, they spread a bold claim: Julia Maesa's grandson, the young Severus Alexander, was none other than the illegitimate son of the late Caracalla. This assertion, bordering on a brazen lie, became the cornerstone of their conspiracy. Without losing a moment, they immediately proclaimed him emperor, defying the usurper Macrinus. After Macrinus's forces suffered a crushing defeat in the decisive Battle of Antioch, a new star rose on Rome's political horizon. Thus, at just 14 years old, Julia Maesa's grandson, whose childhood had been spent in the shadow of grand intrigues, found himself at the pinnacle of imperial power, and his reign promised to be full of surprises and challenges. Historical chronicles recorded this ruler's name as Elagabalus, given in honor of the deity Elagabal he revered. However, his official imperial name was Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, a title deliberately adopted to bolster highly dubious claims of blood kinship with the preceding Emperor Caracalla, which was, in essence, a political ploy. Julia Maesa, the powerful figure behind the throne, sought to entirely control the young Elagabalus, seeing this as a guarantee of preserving her influence and position of power. However, the emperor's increasing eccentricity and unpredictable behavior caused clear alienation among both members of the Senate and the legions, which inevitably threatened her own hard-won status and authority. In an attempt to retain the reins of power and prevent a complete loss of influence, Julia Maesa took a decisive step. She persuaded Emperor Elagabalus to elevate his younger cousin, the young Severus Alexander. This strategic move included formal adoption and the bestowal of the honorary title of Caesar upon Alexander, making him a potential heir. Despite the carefully crafted public image of agreement and harmony that accompanied the adoption, the real relationship between Severus Alexander and his older cousin steadily deteriorated. Historical evidence indicates that Elagabalus, realizing his inability to fully control his younger relative, made at least 2 attempts to physically eliminate Severus Alexander. Elagabalus's suspicions grew daily as Severus Alexander's popularity significantly surpassed his own. The emperor's additional anger was fueled by the active involvement of Julia Maesa, Alexander's mother, in her son's education and upbringing, which, in Elagabalus's view, prevented his full participation in the sacred rituals and priestly duties associated with the cult of Elagabal. When Alexander did not appear in public for some time, the Praetorian Guard became concerned, suspecting that Elagabalus might have harmed his cousin. To defuse the tension, Elagabalus was forced to personally appear at Castra Praetoria. And although Severus Alexander proved to be safe and sound, soon arriving at the camp on his own, Elagabalus met his demise, and Severus Alexander was proclaimed Augustus on March 13, 222 AD, being at that time only a 13-year-old youth. Severus Alexander's mother, Julia Mamaea, and his grandmother, Misa, wielded significant influence over the young emperor. The new administration immediately took steps to appease the Senate, integrating prominent members of that venerable body into the imperial council. A particularly notable figure among the other council members who provided advisory assistance to Severus Alexander at the beginning of his reign was the jurist Ulpian. This distinguished legal scholar had previously served as a legal advisor for both Septimius Severus and Caracalla. Ulpian assumed the role of the young emperor's mentor and was appointed the sole praetorian prefect. The historian Cassius Dio testifies that Ulpian eliminated numerous abuses introduced by Elagabalus. However, his tenure in power proved brief. In 223 AD, Ulpian met a violent end at the hands of the Praetorians. Severus Alexander's inability to protect his prefect, who sought refuge from the guardsmen in the imperial palace, vividly demonstrates the complex dynamic between the emperor and his soldiers. This relationship grew increasingly fragile and unpredictable throughout his reign. Unfortunately, a significant portion of Severus Alexander's reign has been lost to posterity. Historians lack reliable sources capable of shedding light on most of his time in power. Cassius Dio, being a contemporary of the events he described and even holding a consular position jointly with the emperor himself, concluded his narrative at this point, as his numerous gubernatorial appointments required his constant presence away from the Eternal City. He himself admitted that his subsequent accounts were less accurate. As for Herodian, though he was a contemporary witness of the era, his work is quite superficial and primarily intended for the Greek East. The emperor's biography presented in the Historia Augusta, however, appears to be largely fabricated. Nevertheless, Rome enjoyed a period of peace and stability, primarily in the 220s, which provided the new regime with precious time to focus on internal affairs and stabilize the situation after many years of inadequate leadership. Severus Alexander inherited a relatively bleak financial situation from Elagabalus, but he undertook significant reforms of state finances. As a result of these efforts, numerous structures throughout Rome were restored, including the magnificent Colosseum, as well as the grand baths of Caracalla and Nero. Rome's long-standing antagonist in the east, the Parthian Empire, had for a prolonged period been shaken by internal turmoil caused by a succession of civil strife. Consequently, by 224 AD, it was definitively displaced by a new, energetic Persian dynasty. Thus began the triumphant rise of Sasanian Persia, led by the distinguished unifier Ardashir I. This new empire demonstrated significantly greater bellicosity and expansionist ambitions than its Parthian predecessors. Ardashir immediately began to expand the borders of his dominion, absorbing polities located around former Parthian territories. This process naturally led to direct contact with the borderlands of the Roman Empire. Persian troops attacked Hatra in 229 AD, and by 230 AD, Emperor Severus Alexander was actively preparing for a large-scale eastern campaign, commencing his march in the following year, 231 AD. However, within the Eastern Roman armies, serious problems apparently brewed. The Mesopotamian legions, for example, assassinated their governor, while military formations from Egypt demonstrated clear unrest and insubordination. During this period, coins were issued, pompously proclaiming the army's impeccable loyalty, which, as is known, often serves more as a reflection of desired circumstances than reality. Initially, Alexander attempted to resolve the conflict with the Persians through diplomatic means. However, encountering failure in these negotiations, he developed a strategic plan to attack Ardashir. Using Antioch as his primary operational base, Alexander organized an offensive, dividing his forces into 3 columns. He personally led the central one, while the other 2 moved north and south respectively. One group headed to Armenia with a subsequent advance into Mesopotamia, and the other made for the Sasanian capital, Ctesiphon. The outcomes of this campaign were mixed. Both sides suffered colossal losses, but the damage was particularly severe for the Roman troops, who were forced to retreat through the harsh and hostile highlands of Armenia. Although Herodian presented an extremely unflattering assessment of this military campaign, and Rome seemingly did indeed face tangible losses, the true results of Emperor Severus Alexander's actions were likely not as devastating as some chroniclers portrayed them. Notably, the Persian side, after the cessation of active hostilities, demonstrated surprising calm, creating no significant difficulties for Rome until the 240s, when Ardashir's successor came to power. Furthermore, the Roman Empire not only managed to retain control over strategically important Mesopotamia but also forced Sasanian military units to an organized retreat and subsequent regrouping. And although no official peace agreement apparently was concluded between Rome and Persia during that period, the emperor's attention was urgently diverted to brewing problems on the northern frontiers. While still in Antioch, Alexander received alarming news of growing unrest in the regions bordering the empire along the Rhine and Danube. In response, he returned to Rome in 232 AD, where he triumphantly celebrated his victory over Persia before immediately beginning preparations for a new military campaign in the northern direction. Death in the north. Emperor Severus Alexander made a strategic decision, choosing Mogontiacum as his primary operational base. In 234 AD, he launched an active offensive against the Germanic tribes, who by this time had united into a powerful confederation known as the Alemanni. However, after an initial, rather powerful assault, Emperor Alexander, demonstrating pragmatism, began to seek diplomatic solutions to the conflict. It is presumed that he offered the Germanic tribes significant sums of money and possibly regular food supplies as tribute, seeking thereby to buy off their aggressive raids and stabilize the border situation. This state of affairs provoked deep discontent within the ranks of the Roman army. The soldiers fighting under Severus Alexander openly expressed their dissatisfaction that they were denied the traditional opportunity for personal enrichment through military spoils. They also resented, perceiving their emperor's actions as a display of cowardice. The legions whose loved ones had suffered from enemy raids were particularly enraged by the desire for retribution. They categorically rejected both the retreat itself and the subsequent payment of subsidies to the very tribes that, in their opinion, were now being rewarded for aggressive actions against Roman territories. For a long time, Severus Alexander demonstrated an inability to decisively assert and maintain his authority among the military units. This chronic weakening of imperial power ultimately led to the legions, with unprecedented audacity, proclaiming one of their commanders, Gaius Julius Verus Maximinus, as Augustus. Notably, this officer had previously been appointed by the emperor himself to oversee the training of recruits. At a decisive moment, in the spring of 235 AD, Severus Alexander's fate was sealed. He was definitively betrayed and abandoned by his personal guard, the Praetorians, who unhesitatingly defected to Maximinus. Left without the protection of his bodyguards, the emperor and his mother, who invariably accompanied him on all military campaigns, tragically perished in their camp near Mogontiacum. Maximinus Thrax, a native of Thrace, dedicated himself to a military career, rapidly ascending through the ranks. He was destined to go down in history as the first soldier to reach the imperial throne. This significant event occurred just a few decades after Septimius Severus implemented large-scale reforms that not only opened new horizons for military careers but also significantly broadened the recruitment base and simplified the promotion process for outstanding soldiers and junior officers. The era of Severus Alexander's reign was characterized predominantly by peace and relative stability. The emperor's numerous achievements during this period often remained overshadowed by the influence of the powerful imperial women surrounding him, or escaped the attention of researchers due to an excessive focus on the military difficulties he faced in the final years of his life. However, in fairness, there are many reasons for his reign to be properly recognized and appreciated. Even Herodian, historian known for his critical stance towards Alexander, especially regarding the evident influence of his mother on state affairs, albeit reluctantly, was nevertheless forced to concede that his emperorship was virtually faultless in all aspects, with the exception of his mother's missteps, whose actions brought undue censure upon the emperor himself.